With the last map. The torn map becomes a living thing in Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy's hands, its coffee-stained edges trembling not from the January wind cutting through the Vosges mountains, but from something deeper, the weight of 27 lives balanced against pencil marks that might be wrong. Snow falls steadily on the frozen foxholes where his scattered company waits, their breath forming small clouds that dissipate like hope in the grey morning air. The 3rd Infantry Division positions that seemed so solid on paper yesterday now feel like islands in a hostile sea, each man wondering if the next artillery shell will find their particular piece of French earth. Murphy traces his finger along the hand-drawn route one more time, comparing it to terrain features that exist only in his memory of childhood hunts in Texas Hill Country. The official withdrawal routes marked in blue ink might as well be painted targets. German machine gun teams have been watching those roads since before dawn, waiting for desperate Americans to follow doctrine straight into killing fields. But this other path, the one that exists in the spaces between what mapmakers bothered to record, might lead home if his instincts haven't finally betrayed him. Sergeant Kowalski crawls up beside him, snow caking his wool overcoat, and peers at the map with the skeptical expression of a man who's survived 3 campaigns by trusting nothing that can't shoot back. The veteran non-com has watched Murphy pull impossible solutions out of impossible situations before, but this morning feels different. The kind of different that gets written up in after-action reports as either miraculous leadership or criminal recklessness, depending on who lives to tell it. "Lieutenant, the boys are asking questions I don't know how to answer," Kowalski whispers, nodding toward the tree line where exhausted faces peer through the morning mist. "They want to know if we're waiting for relief or planning to die here like heroes." Murphy folds the map carefully, protecting it from the snow that's already erasing their footprints and will soon erase any trace they ever occupied this particular piece of the Vosges Mountains. Behind him, 27 men from 3 different platoons huddle in whatever cover they can find, united only by the accident of survival and the growing certainty that standard operating procedures won't save them this time. The radio that might have summoned help lies in pieces after a near miss from German mortars, its shattered components scattered like broken promises among the pine needles. The sound that changes everything comes not as a roar, but as a whisper, the distant grinding of tank tracks on frozen ground, approaching from the direction of their planned retreat route. Murphy doesn't need binoculars to know what that means. The trap that caught them 18 hours ago is about to close completely. In 30 minutes, maybe less, staying put will no longer be an option, and following the blue lines on the map will be suicide. But the third choice, the one that lives somewhere between military doctrine and pure faith, requires asking these men to follow him into terrain that might exist only in his imagination. "Tell them we're going home," Murphy says finally, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that has kept his men alive through campaigns where certainty was the first casualty. Just not the way anybody planned. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The decision to trust invisible paths over marked roads feels like stepping off a cliff, except the cliff might be safer than what waits on solid ground. Murphy leads them away from anything resembling an official trail, following a creek bed that curves behind German positions like a secret written in the landscape itself. The men move in single file, each step taking them further from the doctrine that has kept them alive for months and deeper into territory that exists somewhere between tactics and faith. Private Johnson, barely 18 and still flinching at every distant shell burst, stays close enough to Murphy to whisper questions that have no good answers. The kid joined the company 2 weeks ago as a replacement for someone whose name nobody mentions anymore, and he's spent those weeks learning that survival depends less on what they taught him in basic training and more on reading the mood of men who've learned to smell death on the wind. "Sir, this don't look like any route on the map," Johnson murmurs as they squeeze between boulders that shouldn't exist according to the topographical survey. "How do you know where we're going?" Murphy pauses at what might be an old shepherd's path, or might be his imagination, studying the way snow has drifted against rocks that could provide cover, or could funnel them straight into an ambush. The Vosges Mountains keep their secrets well, and asking them to reveal safe passage feels like asking for a miracle from a god who's been too busy lately to answer prayers from foxholes. "Same way my grandfather knew where the deer trails were," Murphy answers, knowing it sounds like madness, but unable to explain it any other way. "Sometimes the land tells you things that ain't written down anywhere." 50 yards behind them, Sergeant Kowalski makes hand signals that keep the column moving, while his eyes scan terrain features that make no tactical sense. The veteran has followed officers through 3 campaigns, watching some lead their men to safety and others lead them to graves marked only by dog tags and regret. But Murphy feels different, not fearless, because Kowalski can see the fear in his eyes, but willing to carry that fear forward in service of something larger than individual survival. The sound of German voices drifts through the trees, close enough to make out individual words even if their meaning remains foreign. Murphy freezes the column with a single raised fist, 27 men becoming statues in a landscape that suddenly feels alive with hostile attention. For 10 minutes they wait, listening to an enemy patrol pass within yards of their hiding spot, each man learning again that survival often depends on perfect stillness rather than perfect movement. When the voices fade, Murphy continues up a slope that the map shows as impassable cliff face, but reveals itself as a series of natural terraces that might have been carved by water, or might have been carved by generations of feet following the same impossible route. Each step takes them higher above the valley floor, above the German positions, above the neat lines and symbols that reduce warfare to something manageable on paper. The morning mist begins to lift as they climb, revealing glimpses of the battlefield below like scenes from someone else's war. From this elevation, Murphy can see the pattern of enemy deployment, the corridors between machine gun nests, the route that will take them home if they can trust their footing on ground that maps insist doesn't exist. "Jesus Christ," whispers Johnson, staring down at German positions they've somehow bypassed. "How did you know?" Murphy doesn't answer because he doesn't know himself, only that sometimes the choice between following orders and following instincts becomes the choice between dying according to doctrine or living according to faith. The map remains folded in his pocket, but the real navigation is happening in the conversation between memory and landscape, between what he learned hunting in Texas and what these French mountains are willing to teach. The view from the ridge reveals more than German positions. It shows the full scope of their isolation, like looking at a medical diagram of your own disease. Below them, enemy forces control every marked route back to American lines, their machine gun nests positioned with the precision of men, who've had time to study the same maps Murphy carries. The 3rd Infantry Division's forward positions seem impossibly distant, separated by miles of hostile territory and the growing certainty that relief forces have their own problems to solve. Murphy spreads his map against a boulder, comparing the penciled route to what his eyes can see, while behind him 27 men wait for decisions that will either vindicate this madness or confirm their worst fears about following a 20-year-old lieutenant into terrain that officially doesn't exist. The morning sun cuts through the Vosges Mountains' perpetual mist, revealing details that make his pulse quicken. A series of abandoned farm terraces that could provide concealment, a dry creek bed that threads between observation posts like a path designed by someone who understood this ground better than any military engineer. Corporal Martinez, the company's most reliable squad leader, crawls up beside him with news from the rear guard that changes the mathematics of their situation. The veteran's face carries the expression of a man delivering a medical diagnosis, and Murphy knows what he's going to hear before the words form. "Sir, that tank column we heard earlier, they're not just blocking our retreat. They're sweeping this whole sector, pushing anything American back toward the main German positions." Martinez pauses, letting the implications settle. "We've got maybe an hour before they reach this ridge." The news spreads through the group in whispers that carry more weight than artillery shells. These men have survived campaigns where retreat was a tactical option, but now they're learning what it feels like when all the exits close simultaneously. Murphy studies faces that reflect his own calculation, that following the map means walking into prepared positions, that staying put means capture or death, and that his invisible route might be their only chance or their final mistake. Private Johnson, still young enough to believe that officers always have plans, asks the question that hangs over them like smoke from distant fires. "What happens if your way doesn't work, sir? What happens if we get lost out there?" Murphy looks at the kid, seeing himself 18 months ago when getting lost was the worst thing he could imagine. Now he knows there are worse things than being lost, like being found by the wrong people or leading good men into situations where courage isn't enough to change the outcome. "Then we get lost together," Murphy says finally. But lost and moving is better than found and dead. The decision to abandon official routes feels like tearing up a lifeline, but Murphy folds the map and returns it to his pocket, keeping only the parts that match what he can see with his own eyes. Behind him, men who've followed orders through 3 campaigns prepare to follow instincts they can't verify, trusting something that exists in the space between what you can prove and what you choose to believe. As they prepare to descend the far side of the ridge, following game trails that might lead to safety or might lead to ambush, Murphy catches Sergeant Kowalski watching him with the expression of a man placing a bet with stakes he can't afford to lose. The veteran has seen officers break under pressure that was lighter than this, but he's also seen miracles happen when ordinary men decide that dying isn't acceptable and impossible isn't final. The sound of German engines grows closer, reminding them that time has become their enemy, along with everything else. In 10 minutes, they'll begin the descent into territory that exists only on Murphy's internal map, following routes that will either prove his grandfather's lessons about reading the land or demonstrate that some kinds of knowledge don't translate from Texas hills to French mountains. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The descent begins like a controlled fall through terrain that shifts between barely possible and completely insane. Murphy leads them down what might be an ancient smuggler's route or might be the path water takes when winter snow melts too fast, following switchbacks that appear just when the grade becomes too steep and disappear just before they become obvious to enemy observers. Behind him, 27 men learn that trust becomes a physical act. Each handhold, each careful step on loose stone, each decision to keep moving when common sense screams to go back. The German tank sounds grow closer, their mechanical grinding echoing off the Vosges mountains' rocky faces like the heartbeat of some iron beast hunting through the forest. Murphy can hear individual engines now, can distinguish the higher whine of armored cars from the deeper rumble of assault guns, and knows they're running out of time to reach concealment before the enemy completes their sweep of the ridge above. Halfway down the slope, Private Johnson's nerve finally breaks. The kid freezes on a narrow ledge, staring at the drop below with eyes that have seen too much in his 2 weeks with the company. His hands shake as he grips the rock face, and Murphy can see the moment when fear transforms from motivation into paralysis. "I can't do this, sir," Johnson whispers, his voice barely audible above the wind through the pines. "I can't see where we're going, and I can't see how we get back if this goes wrong." Murphy works his way back to the ledge, knowing that one man's breakdown could doom them all if the fear spreads through the column. But looking at Johnson's face, he sees himself from 18 months ago, before he learned that being afraid and being unable to move forward were two different things entirely. "You don't have to see the whole route," Murphy says quietly, placing his hand on the kid's shoulder. "You just have to see the next step, and then the next one after that. That's all any of us can see right now." The words carry more than tactical advice. They carry the accumulated weight of every impossible situation Murphy has navigated by reducing the overwhelming to the manageable, the strategic to the immediate. Johnson's breathing slows, and after a moment that feels like an hour, he nods and continues down the slope. At the bottom of the descent, Murphy's route proves itself in ways that military manuals don't account for. The abandoned farm terraces he spotted from the ridge provide exactly the concealment he hoped for, while the dry creek bed offers a corridor that threads between German positions with the precision of something planned by engineers who understood this ground better than any current occupant. As they move through terrain that shouldn't exist, according to official surveys, Murphy begins to understand something that will haunt him for decades afterward. That his grandfather's lessons about reading the land work, because land remembers things that maps forget. The trails they're following were carved by generations of feet seeking the safest routes through dangerous territory, worn smooth by people who had to navigate by instinct because failure meant death. Sergeant Kowalski, moving with the steady competence of a man who's learned to trust what keeps him alive, signals back to Murphy that he can see American positions ahead, distant but real, separated from their current location by perhaps 1,000 yards of questionable ground. The relief in his gesture carries through the entire column, but Murphy knows the hardest part still waits, reaching friendly lines without getting shot by their own nervous sentries. The final approach requires timing that borders on telepathy and luck that feels like divine intervention. Using hand signals learned in training but refined by necessity, Murphy coordinates movement that will either deliver 27 men to safety or expose them all to final catastrophe. As they prepare for the last dash across open ground, he touches the folded map in his pocket one final time, knowing that what saved them exists nowhere on paper but everywhere in the conversation between instinct and faith that has guided them home. The approach to American lines reveals the secret that will never appear in any after-action report. Murphy's route didn't just bypass German positions, it placed them exactly where confused and exhausted sentries might mistake them for enemy infiltrators. 50 yards from safety, everything depends on being recognized as Americans before nervous riflemen decide to shoot first and identify bodies later. The irony tastes bitter as winter air, surviving 18 hours behind enemy lines only to face death from friendly fire in the final moments. Murphy removes his helmet, knowing that his size and obvious youth might be the only things that save them from becoming casualties of mistaken identity. He signals the column to spread out, each man visible but non-threatening, hands positioned where weapons can be seen and recognized as American equipment. The next 60 seconds will determine whether his grandfather's lessons about reading the land can overcome the paranoia that keeps frontline soldiers alive. "American patrol coming in!" Murphy shouts across the frozen ground, his voice carrying the accent that marks him as clearly from Texas as his tactics mark him as clearly unconventional. 27 men from Charlie Company, returning from reconnaissance. The response comes in the form of 3 rifle barrels tracking their movement. And for a moment that stretches like hours. Murphy understands that survival sometimes depends on convincing your own people that you deserve to live. The recognition, when it finally comes, arrives as a voice he knows, Lieutenant Patterson from Baker Company, whose foxhole they shared 2 nights ago during an artillery barrage that lasted until dawn. "Jesus Christ, Murphy, where the hell have you been?" Patterson's relief carries across the snow like absolution. "Battalion's been writing you people off since yesterday afternoon." The reunion happens in stages. First, the grateful collapse into friendly foxholes, then the hot coffee that tastes like civilization, then the questions that Murphy realizes he can't answer without sounding either insane or mystical. How do you explain following routes that exist only in intuition? How do you describe navigation that depends on conversations between memory and landscape that make sense only when death provides the motivation? Captain Williams, the company commander who's been carrying Murphy's unit as missing in action for 18 hours, listens to the report with the expression of a man trying to reconcile paperwork with miracles. The official version will record exceptional leadership and tactical innovation, but sitting in the command post that morning, Murphy knows the truth is smaller and larger than anything that fits military categories. "Son, I need you to show me this route on the map," Williams says, spreading the same topographical survey that Murphy has carried for 2 days. "If it's viable, we might be able to use it for other operations." Murphy studies the map, trying to translate what he felt in his bones into lines and symbols that other people can follow. But the route that saved 27 lives exists only in the specific conversation between desperation and faith that happened yesterday morning. Only in the particular way that fear and responsibility combined to make impossible terrain navigable. "Sir, I'm not sure it would work again," Murphy says finally, knowing he's confessing to something that sounds like mysticism in a world that runs on logistics and firepower. It might have been just right for that moment, with that weather, with those particular conditions. The words feel inadequate, but they contain a truth that will follow Murphy for the rest of his life, that the actions that make legends often depend on circumstances so specific they can't be repeated, on decisions so personal they can't be systematized. The map gets filed with other unit documents, but the knowledge that saved them remains untranslatable, trapped in the space between what you can teach and what you can only experience. Years later, when reporters ask about his techniques and tactics, Murphy will remember this moment, sitting in a command post, trying to explain how instinct became strategy, how desperation became navigation, how 27 lives were saved by trusting something that couldn't be verified until it worked. The real secret isn't tactical, it's personal. Sometimes survival depends on being willing to trust what you can't prove, in moments when proof is a luxury you can't afford. The after-action report transforms Murphy's route into 3 sentences of military prose. Unit conducted movement through difficult terrain to evade enemy forces. Alternative routes identified and successfully utilized. No casualties sustained during withdrawal. The paperwork files away 18 hours of terror and faith, as if they were routine logistics, reducing what felt like a conversation between desperation and divine intervention to the kind of language that fits in filing cabinets. Captain Williams signs the report without ceremony, but Murphy catches him studying the map one more time, tracing routes that officially exist and routes that officially don't. The captain has survived 2 campaigns by understanding the difference between what works on paper and what works in mud, and he knows that some kinds of success resist documentation. "Lieutenant," Williams says quietly, looking up from the paperwork that will follow Murphy for the rest of his military career, "what you did out there, that's not something they teach at officer candidate school." Murphy nods, knowing that the captain is asking him to carry something that can't be written down. The knowledge that exceptional leadership sometimes means abandoning everything you were taught in favor of everything you hope might work. The weight of that responsibility feels heavier than fear, more permanent than exhaustion. 3 weeks later, Private Johnson approaches Murphy during a lull in fighting near Strasbourg, carrying the same torn map that guided them home through the Vosges mountains. The kid has grown older in ways that have nothing to do with time, his eyes reflecting the particular gravity that comes from understanding how close death can approach before retreating. "Sir, I've been thinking about what you said on that ledge," Johnson says, holding the map like a sacred text. about only needing to see the next step. I wanted you to know that's how I've been getting through everything since then. The conversation ends without ceremony, but Murphy understands that he's just learned something about leadership that doesn't appear in any manual, that the words you speak in moments of crisis can echo in other people's lives for years afterward, shaping how they navigate their own impossible terrain. 40 years later, sitting in a suburban kitchen that smells of coffee and morning sunlight, Murphy will pause during an interview about his war experiences, his hands tracing invisible routes on the Formica table surface. The reporter will ask about tactics and training, about the sources of his reputation for finding solutions where none existed, but Murphy's answer will drift toward that January morning in the Vosges, when 27 men trusted him to follow routes that existed nowhere except in the conversation between memory and faith. Sometimes you just have to trust what the land tells you, he'll say finally, knowing it sounds mystical to people who've never had to navigate by instinct through territory that wants to kill you. My grandfather taught me that when I was hunting deer in Texas. I never expected to use it, hunting for ways to keep men alive in France. The interview will edit out his longest pauses, the moments when his eyes focus on something the reporter can't see, the way his fingers move across the table as if following trails that disappeared decades ago, but remain mapped somewhere deeper than memory. The published story will focus on leadership and tactical innovation, but Murphy will know that the real story lives in the silence between words, in the weight of carrying decisions that saved lives by trusting what couldn't be proven until it worked. The map itself disappears somewhere in the chaos of war's end, but Murphy carries its lessons through every subsequent crisis, every moment when official solutions prove inadequate, and survival depends on being willing to trust the conversation between desperation and faith that guides ordinary men through extraordinary circumstances. The roots that save us, he learns, exist only in the spaces between what we can see and what we choose to believe. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.